Hi, everyone. I'm Sheila Warren. As Brian noted, I am the head of blockchain and distributed ledger at the World Economic Forum. Now, in 2017, the forum decided to open an office in San Francisco in the Presidio, focusing specifically on 4IR technologies. So fourth industrial revolution technologies, these new emerging technologies that we think, in conjunction with each other, are going to wind up transforming the way that we do business, the way that governments engage with citizens, and the way that we engage with each other. We focus at the center on blockchain, AI, data policy, drones, etc. But it was kind of a radical idea to create an entire center for an institution like the Forum, based in the Valley, focused on technologies globally. And back in the day, which isn't even that long ago, in 2017, we had a kind of different orientation to technology than a lot of other players in this space. And I thought it'd be interesting to kind of walk you through, in the years since I've been in this role, I started the role, the office opened in 2017 in the spring, so we're exactly 3 years old. And what's changed? How is the conversation in Davos, the conversation at the Forum, the conversation in what we could call the traditional kind of halls of power, how is it different around this technology? These two adorable cuties are my daughters. And I have a habit of kind of asking them periodically, what is it that you think I do? And the usual answer is, you talk on your phone, and you type on your computer, and you get on airplanes. And I'm like, yeah, I do those things. That's true. All of that is definitely true. But this time I asked my older one, the one on the right, before I left for this conference, and I said, what is it that you think Mom does? And she said, you work really hard to make sure that everyone has a chance to have a happy life. And that was heart-stoppingly accurate in terms of what motivates me. But it also is, I think, one of the best phrases to kind of encompass what I think motivates a lot of us in this space, why we think this technology is important. Now, you couldn't possibly know this, but this photo was taken shortly after I began at the center, at the Forum, in this role. And shortly thereafter, I went to my first Davos in this role. So the first time that the Forum had a head of blockchain, and in Davos that year, it was an interesting time. This was 2018. And as you may recall, Bitcoin was doing this, Ethereum was doing this. Bitcoin had become kind of a household name. It was getting tons of press and coverage. And you really couldn't walk down, it was this, right? Like, you couldn't walk down the promenade, which is kind of the main drag in Davos, without seeing, crypto headquarters, crypto cave, crypto bananas. It was really, really intense. And the reason for that was because everyone thought there was this money grab to happen. And to be fair, a lot of people made a lot of money in those days. It was kind of Lambo land, right? Like, you did this, you did that, you were investing. We were in sort of peak ICO. We were entering peak ICO white paper. I got handed probably 4,000, QR code white papers that year in 2018. And the conversation, I think, was really about the differences between Bitcoin and blockchain. Nobody in this sort of community really understood what blockchain was. So I did 40 interviews, let's call it, in those 3 days, where all I said over and over and over again was the technology is distinct from the application. I mean, things that are really, really obvious in retrospect. But that is where the messaging was. That is what a lot of these companies, government leaders, needed to understand. Okay? We have come a very, very long way in 3 short years, let me tell you. Actually, 2 short years. That was Davos 2018. The other thing people were talking about, in addition to all the money to be made, was supply chains. Okay? And the idea that this was kind of the first, I would say, business kind of use case besides money and currency that really took root or took hold in the Forum's communities. Okay? They understood that there was an efficiency to be gained. You could do things, basically faster, right? And it really felt like this. Like, we're just going to kind of barrel along and make everything more efficient and move in that direction. And look, that's nothing to sneeze at. As a place to start, I think it's a very real use case. I think it's something that really helped a lot of people who were lay people in this space get an understanding of why a decentralized distributed network was interesting, why eliminating an intermediary could be valuable, what peer-to-peer actually means, and how that could actually create benefit to their businesses, to their citizens, whatever it might be. Okay? But a lot of the conversation really was about this idea. We have a system, We're gonna tie the rocket ship of a blockchain to it. We're gonna put that on the back end, and we're just gonna catapult ourselves into space. But we're kind of doing everything we're doing, we're just doing it a little better, or a little faster, a little more efficiently. We're cutting out some waste. And that's a very different conversation than I think a lot of us who are deep in the space were having. So there was a mismatch there, even as there was a lot of attention being paid to this topic. Okay, now in parallel, interestingly, there was this broad recognition that there was an erosion of our institutions, an erosion of public trust, right? Fake news, media, elections, democracy, whatever was going on. There were all kinds of indicators, very obviously, that there was a problem. There was concern that our institutions weren't serving us, weren't serving enough citizens in the world, and weren't even serving citizens who might be doing okay as well as they could be. But there wasn't a marriage of those two ideas. They were kind of held separately. This was still the era when, Bitcoin criminals, they're all gonna steal our money, whatever. This was that conversation in 2018. Okay, now, the best thing I think that happened to the space was the collapse of the hype. We entered a new phase of that hype cycle. We had regulation a little bit around some of the ICOs. We didn't have this rush to kind of fund and get money through new means. And it gave us the time as a community to start work on these foundations, or not start work, but to really further the work on this foundational layer, which is, I know, what many of you in this room are working hard on. Our fundamental premise is that technology has come a long way. It still has a long way to go, but it's obviously not a silver bullet. And you have to have a policy layer that allows for a modification of the way certain systems run in order to really realize the benefits of this technology. Now that sounds kind of obvious, but it's the hardest thing to do. In order to avoid just strapping on that rocket launcher and catapulting our existing systems into the stratosphere, we have to start rethinking the foundational building blocks of not just our tech or our tech stack, but also of the way that we allow interactions to happen, right? And this involves a lot of new thinking, addressing a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty in parallel as we're building these systems. Okay, so I know that Brian spoke quite a bit about blockchain and the SDGs, but some of the things that we've been really excited about are applications that we're seeing in climate, the environment, et cetera. And the conversation has moved dramatically away from just money, just sort of supply chains in a business context. And these are all things that in the past couple of years we've seen tremendous excitement around. We actually published a paper in 2018, I believe, called Building Blocks for a Better Planet. And basically it walked through a whole bunch of use cases in the environment space, in the climate space, microgrids, prosumer and electricity, tracing, track and trace, ocean cleanup, all these kinds of things, sustainable agriculture, all these kinds of things that are very, very real, active experiments happening today. We're not seeing the same attention, I think as Dawn noted, on the blockchain part of these things. It's a little more on the policies, because blockchain is one piece of a much bigger solution, but a critical piece. We're also seeing, if you don't know this clip, this is a I Love Lucy episode called The Chocolate Factory that is hilarious. But we're now seeing, in addition to just supply chain and sort of origin sourcing and things like that, which again are really exciting, we're now seeing more experimentation with tokenization models. So how do we shift from what we at the forum called shareholder capitalism, or an extractive model, to stakeholder capitalism, where you're actually acknowledging that in many cases consumers are producers, or you're actually saying, how do we actually, rather than just paying for them in chocolate stuffed down their shirts, how do we actually acknowledge the contributions by the workforce and accommodate that in a kind of circular system that allows for micropayments or other kinds of payments based on certain triggers. All of this is empowered by blockchain. A blockchain can't solve that, can't make a company want to do this, but it can make it much easier when they decide to go in that direction. It's a critical tool to enable that kind of change. I could watch this forever. We launched a project in Colombia in conjunction with the Inter-American Development Bank. And this is focused on the transparency and enhancement of trust attributes of blockchain. So in all of our projects, we try to really break down what makes a blockchain unique. What are the things about a blockchain that are different, and that particularly when combined with other kinds of policies or technologies can actually lead to a change in the way that we do business, whatever that might look like. So in the country of Colombia, they were very concerned about corruption in public procurement. government contracts. Okay, so there was a big scandal that broke in 2018 that talked about the school food program. This is literally the program that provides funding for kids, not just kids who aren't wealthy, but all kids in million schools to get their school lunch. Okay. Tremendous corruption in this. There was this famous video at the time that came out that showed this bucket of greens that were meant to be delivered to a school, and underneath it was all rocks, right? This kind of thing, right? These are food literally out of the mouths of babes. So we spoke to the Inspector General's office in Colombia and the Inter-American Development Bank, and together we created a partnership to build a blockchain-backed solution, a system, for taking bids in this process. It's solving one small part of the problem, or we're attempting to solve that as a pilot experiment. And the idea there is, what if we could make information more transparent, which a blockchain can do, right? Obviously, if you design it that way. What would that actually do? Now, I say this a lot, but transparency is not an end goal in and of itself. It has to be, you have to think about transparency of what to whom, like what is the purpose, okay? If you don't educate people what they're seeing, what is the information that we're seeing through this blockchain system, they don't know what to do with it. It's not actionable information. And I think one thing we do as a community is we kind of see these ends as that's it. Like if things are transparent, then it'll all get better. That's not how it works. You need to have a civic engagement policy that accompanies this kind of thing to educate citizen journalists, the media, civil society organizations. What are you seeing? How do you spot corruption? And then how do you hold those actors accountable? How do you create new incentives to not engage in corrupt behavior? And then when it's spotted, how do you enhance the cycle? How do you put that rocket ship on something like that? How do you make it faster to hold people accountable? So that's the experiment we're doing, and we're going to see how it goes. We are very open to publishing success and failure. We think it's very important to do that. The space is so new. We're all learning from each other. And our view is that a blockchain probably isn't strictly necessary in this case, but it's going to provide some enhancements, and more importantly, the education component that's going to happen along with this project is going to allow for a broader accountability within a system that isn't really currently working all that well. I'll also mention the refugee camp situation. I think that most of you are familiar with this. Was an early use case that got a lot of attention. It's now been modified, and there are a number of different actors looking at this. The idea here is, how do you provide some dignity to people who are in a situation where they've been ripped, all their dignity has been stripped from them, okay? They've come from a pretty often comfortable, stable environment that rapidly disintegrated. This is actually Burundi, a Burundi refugee camp. It's a lesser known refugee crisis in the world. And they have been tremendously destabilized in where they live. They had to flee, often with whatever they had on their backs. And they're now trying to create a life in an environment that's radically different. And one thing that we know from deep psychological examination over longitudinal studies is that when people, ironically, can act as a consumer, when they have the ability to actually engage in a kind of ordinary, what you call a very ordinary transaction, like buying your coffee or whatever it might be, that provides a sense of security. They have some agency over their own decision-making for themselves and their families. A digital wallet can provide that kind of opportunity in a place that's very unsafe and insecure, where theft is very common, right? So these are examples of some of the kinds of cases where the technology is enabling bettering of human lives in a very real way. Okay, and then we have some maybe less sexy examples, but I think are also really important. So this is my generic photo of taxes, okay? So the way that we collect taxes, you'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't be, depending on where you come from, what your home country is. There is a huge problem of corruption in the payment of taxes, or more specifically, the non-payment of taxes in many, many emerging economies. And this is one of the reasons that a lot of these economies remain where they are, and there's a bit of a stagnation, okay? If you were able to actually track the collection of taxes, to hold people accountable for paying taxes correctly and accurately, you could reduce a lot of fraud. You could actually raise GDPs of certain kinds of countries and make them, in many cases, more independent, less susceptible to sort of foreign debt and the strings that often come with that, and create an empowerment situation for a nation as a whole. And this can operate on a state level, it can operate on a national level. In addition, when it comes to repatriation of income, you could imagine how a transparent tracking system that kind of showed a lot of the expatriation of a lot of business, let's say, tax, what that might actually reveal. Right now, it's very hard to get that information. If you could make that more transparent or more visible, you can imagine the change that might occur. Similarly, this is from 30 Rock. This is like the thing Alec Baldwin always points to of like all the different companies and how they feed into this. So the remaking of corporate governance is, again, I think this is fascinating and I nerd out on it, but maybe less sexy, but really, really game-changing, okay? So the DAO is an example of one governance model that a blockchain can enable. Okay. If you could imagine more accountability in governance structures, less ability to create shell corporations, or making that harder, or at least having a chain that could track who actually owns what, I think you can imagine what might happen if that information became more widely available. It's all about shifting of these incentive structures, which is something that a blockchain can help achieve in combination with the right policies. Now, I have a third daughter, surprise. So a year ago, she did not exist. Her birthday is actually coming up. She's almost a year old. And what most people actually don't know is that I had a very difficult healthcare situation after I delivered her. I had to go back to the hospital. And because of confusion around the ability to access my health records, I almost died. Now, I know Dawn mentioned that there are some projects in the work that are focusing on health records and how you can actually use a blockchain to create a more sustainable system. And I say sustainable because if people keep dying, then it's not very sustainable, is it? You could create a system that would actually enable faster and more effective healthcare so that people would not ever be in the situation that I was in, where I was waiting for information that was pretty accessible, it should have been, and that just was not. I think that when I think about why I work in this space, there are many, many reasons. These people, these three little ones I showed you are the major reason. I think that we're all working towards a world where what happened to me would never happen to anyone, certainly not happen to them. And not just in healthcare, but in other spaces as well. Nobody should be food insecure, right, because of corruption in the system. Nobody should not have access to healthcare or vaccinations or whatever they might need in order to live a healthy and happy life. Now, why aren't we there yet? Right? Why haven't we kind of unlocked all of this? Well, I think there are three major reasons. So one is digital identity. And I'm not going to say too much about this because I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, but this is going to come first. Okay? Once we have real traction on a digital identity layer, let's call it, then we're going to see the blockchain unlocked. Without this solution, we are quite limited in what we can do. And you can imagine, in the case of my health records, while I obviously wanted whatever had to happen, I would have posted them in the sky in order to get the care that I needed. However, ordinarily, I would say, there really ought to be some sensitivities around who can see that information and for what purpose, right? Identity is the key to unlocking that digital identity. We're not quite there yet in terms of the understanding of that necessity in the community, the broader community, but also the solutions. So when we get there, we're going to see a sea change. Secondly is kind of a lack of, I would say, coalescence or crystallization around a code of conduct. So to address this, the forum has a global blockchain council. Brian's on it, and some others in this room, Dawn is on it. And we have drafted a blockchain code of conduct, a set of principles that we think ought to be factored into any design or build. We're going to be releasing these shortly. They're going to actually be on GitHub in about a week for public comment from the open source communities. We welcome your comments there. And what we're trying to do is basically say, here's a baseline of how you should think about the design of applications built on top of a blockchain in order to not mitigate the entire purpose of building on a blockchain in the first place. Because if you're building into a protocol, but then everything you're doing on your application is somehow just really like reducing all the benefits, then kind of, is there a point to that? And there might be, but let's be very thoughtful about that. So we're very excited about this. And I think if we have traction on a set of principles like this, it's going to, again, help spur some of the interoperability questions that still plague the business community in this space. And of course, there's the ROI. So for a lot of governments, businesses, there's a question, open question, as to, is this really going to be a good return on investment for us? Maybe we just changed our entire infrastructure 2 years ago, and we put a lot of money into that. Is this really the thing that's going to be moving forward? Now, I think as others have noted, and I will agree, there may be public statements about that, but everyone's paying attention to the blockchain, right? I mean, you kind of have to if you're a business or government now. But we actually co-authored a paper with Accenture last year that was focused on specifically this question. And it contains a blockchain values framework that's a visual depiction of how you kind of get to the best business case that's focused on ROI. And actually, our friends at Accenture are running a workshop tomorrow that will actually take you through how you develop that business case using the framework. I think this, again, had a big impact on our business community in terms of helping them think about, well, how do I make this case? How do I think about what's actually the best for my particular situation? And funnily enough, which you might not expect, governments are using this as well to do a similar evaluation at the CTO level of whether or not the solution is the right time and solving the right problem. So when these three things, I think, unlock identity, the sort of code of conduct, and the use case, the ROI biz case, I think we're going to see a tremendous explosion in the publicness, if you will, the public awareness of what's happening internally in a lot of these institutions. So it still kind of feels like we're jumping out of a plane together to a lot of our community at the forum, but now I'm happy to say there's a lot more understanding and awareness of the value of a blockchain, of what it's for, and I think it's great that we're shifting away from the focus on that topic and talking more about systems transformation, talking more about how a blockchain is one critical piece of a tech stack that's going to enable a massive change in how we think about how we deal with our consumers, how we deal with our customers, how we deal with our producers, how we deal with all the different citizens that we engage with on a daily basis. I remain deeply optimistic about this technology, and I imagine that all of you are as well. And if not, I certainly think you should be. Thank you so much for your time.